want to tell you kind of why I think he's the right guy for us today, because I think Mark is an optimist. He's from Iowa. I'm from North Dakota. We were optimistically moved to Minnesota, so that was step one. Secondly, he was 20 years the president of the Institute for Agriculture and Food Policy, so he knows the whole state. He knows ag, he knows trade policies, and yet he's an optimist. He was Secretary of State from 2006 to 2014 for a couple of terms there. So he knows elections and all the stuff that goes into elections, and yet he is an optimist. And now he is the president of Global Minnesota, which has a goal of connecting Minnesotans from school kids to CEOs with their counterparts all across the globe. And so when you look at all the things happening in these times and all the global challenges and the stuff that's going on in the ag economy and how we get our food, you really need to be an optimist. And so we have a guy who's just the guy for the job, Mark Ritchie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here and inspiring all of you. What a family, what a wonderful crowd, but also for inspiring our friends from downtown St. Paul. I just think your impact as a club is going to expand out in many different ways. But they have a tight timeline. I love this. We're starting right on time, and so I'm going to try to be on time. And I want to explain why I say something to people. I say, like, well, I'm working to bring the World's Fair to Minnesota. And I do get quite a few eye rolls, I have to say. And, that's not like, I might have gotten that from my mother when I made some kind of outrageous excuse or something like that. But I've been through the process of saying to people, it's time that we had another great American World's Fair, and Minnesota is the place it ought to be. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit why I'm optimistic about that and pretty certain about that. But I'm also going to tell you a little story about the little things that have happened along the way, because optimism has to be fueled by the things that we learned when we were young and the things that we experience in our life, and also the people that hold us together when times are not necessarily so easy or difficult or tragic things happen in our life. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of that story and leave half the time for questions, because people always have a question about such a crazy idea. All right. I'm trying to use the microphone, but does this one work? Got it. So when I ran for office, I promised my wife 2 terms. I was fortunate enough to be elected for 2 terms, but I was also fortunate enough to know that that was the right thing to do. But I also knew when I ran for office that, at least for the Secretary of State office, which, by the way, 2/3 of that office is business services. I've probably been on your website or on your screen a few times of some of you. But in any case, I knew that if, in fact, what I was hoping for my state, which was that some young people would be stepping forward to take on leadership roles, a statewide leadership role, that they needed a lot of time, because you got to kind of drive the state. You got to shake a lot of people's hands and talk to a lot of people. So anyhow, I announced a couple years out, somewhat under the guidance of former Governor Quee, and sometime we'll go back and maybe talk about that, because he was really important in my work and in my life in that way. But anyhow, I announced a couple years out that I wasn't going to run again, and except for somebody who leaned out the window one day and called me a quitter, which was really kind of a, if you're an optimist and somebody calls you a quitter, it got deep. But in any case, generally speaking, this was a good thing. But a couple folks from St. Paul, people who are organizers of the Festival of Nations. Some of you know you have a just about 100-year-old, 90-some, I think, Festival of Nations in downtown St. Paul. And they invited me to coffee or for breakfast or something. And at breakfast, they said, Mark, we're thinking about an idea, and we want to know if you might have time or be interested in getting involved with us. We're thinking about trying to bring a World's Fair to Minnesota. And I wasn't in the eye-rolling mode. I was in the oh, the World's Fair to Minnesota. Now, when I was young in Iowa, my folks packed me and my three brothers, all of us together, and we went out to New York in 1964, and we camped on the Long Island Sound, and we went into the '64 World's Fair. And apparently I met my wife there, but we didn't know each other. She was living on Long Island, so she went all the time. I might have met the president there, who lived right across the street from the World's Fair. And as a young man, I mean, World's Fair is pretty exciting when you're young. They're pretty exciting when you're old, too. But that experience of going into that fair had a kind of profound impact on me. And I remembered all of this when they asked me the question. It was a little complicated. My father was a China Marine. He was stationed in China after the war, still in the occupation. Came home with little tiny pictures of people dying in front of his eyes of starvation, and said, I'm going to do something about world hunger. He used a GI Bill to go to farm school, agriculture school, and then he became part of a team that developed electron microscopes, and he went into animal disease research for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he devoted his life to the notion of what can we do about starvation and hunger, which is something I've put a lot of my life into as well. But in any case, his work was scientific. And we were living in a little tiny town, and other kids' dads were, farmers or the baker or ran the newspaper. And scientists didn't just roll off my tongue that easily. I felt kind of like, what's that? And I was a little bit, what about something more normal? But we walked through the gates of the 1964 World's Fair, and I bet there's people in this room who were there. But all of a sudden, all around, you could see this amazing world unfolding. And you go, oh, look at that, driverless cars and video phones. Now we have them in our pockets. But I could feel myself beginning to say, oh yeah, my dad does some of that. Gee, maybe he's kind of cool. Maybe I should crack a book and get with it here a little bit. And yeah, wow, look at this. And so I came home and cracked a few books, and by the time I was 16, I was at Iowa State, also in biochemistry, biophysics. And that whole process just had a big impact on me. So when they asked me this question, would I help, that's what came back. So that's pretty powerful kind of motivation. But then there was that other question, optimistic and, okay, let's check this out here. I said, why don't we have them now? What's the big deal here? And he said, well, the United States just dropped out of everything, global, international, late 1990s, 99, 2000, about that time. We just kind of quit. And we didn't pay our dues, and we got kind of a bad reputation. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually make a bid. But, we're Minnesotans, we're optimistic, and we're pretty well organized. And I thought, okay, I sometimes say to people that, how it's a really good thing you don't actually know all that's involved in raising kids because you might not do it. But because you don't know, you dive in, right? Well, you don't know necessarily how to bring a World's Fair when you just kind of dive in. That's good. But what happened was I said, well, how will I really know if this is a wild goose chase? Because I'm just old enough to abandon wild goose chasing, which is not optimism, but it is a habit of youth, especially, some of us. But they said, well, we don't really know, but there's an international body that decides this. There's an international treaty from the 1920s, that era, 170 countries, they vote, you got to make a bid. The bid's got to come from your government, but they're based in Paris. And if you're over in Europe, you could stop by and ask them. Okay. It turned out I was asked by the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki in Finland to do a series of speeches for the chambers of commerces in local communities in Finland. So I was over there with my wife, took a day, went to Paris, went to this kind of beautiful building. The drawings for the architectural construction of the Eiffel Tower, which is one of the symbols. And so kind of a cool place. But I'm sitting down talking to an older gentleman who's the head guy, director general. And I'm assuming he's French, and I'm using Miss Furley's French from my younger days. You know, can imagine how bad that was. And he leaned over and he said, "Hey, do you know Ricky Rubio?" I go, "Oh my God." He's asking me a question. He's asking me a question in English, and he's asking me a question about somebody I am supposed to know. And you know how you kind of, handed the cookie jar or caught off guard, and you know what I mean? And he goes, and he saved me. He goes, "Well, I'm from Spain." And then he goes, "And when Ricky left Spain, he broke the hearts of all the girls of Spain." And then I began to remember, oh yeah, the dreamboat down at the Wolves. And then he said, when he said he didn't want to play basketball in Spain, this made us all really mad. And so I'm expecting a kind of a, bad weather and, the kind of National Weather Service kind of story. But he said, he went on and on about this, about how he didn't go to Miami and he didn't go to the Celtics and all this. But he said, when Ricky got here, back home in Spain, in his social media and in his media interviews, he would go on and on about, hey, Minnesota's the most beautiful place on the planet. It's the greatest place to play basketball. It's the greatest place to raise kids. And, he's really complimentary. And the old guy says, you don't have to sell us on Minnesota. Ricky has sold us on Minnesota. So an optimist would take that as a signal from God, right? I mean, come on. And when the old guy came here for the site visit, who was playing basketball that night downtown? Yeah. Exactly. Who got to visit him down in the locker room? Mm-hmm. Can you use the most common expression when people talk about a grin from ear to ear? I have a picture of Ricky Rubio and our friend together that night. So call it what you want. But that's how. And I started thinking, okay, the difference between a wild goose chase and something that is really a big lift, things that aren't guaranteed. And I'm late enough in life that not all the trees we plant will we harvest the herald sons from. But this seemed like if we have ambassadors around the world, like Ricky Rubio and others, and you got all those Minnesotans scattered around the world, and you have all these amazing people here who've come here from around the world, maybe we could pull this off. And so when I got back, we started the process of gathering up a group of people who would then give some credibility and some oomph to this process. One of the people heard from me, heard about this was Senator Rudy Boschwitz. He called me up, Mark, you got to come out here and talk to me about this. So I went out, to Wayzata, and his office has got all kinds of amazing pictures. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you want a picture of somebody important in our last, 80 years, there it is. And he said, yes, I went to the 1939 World's Fair. And I thought, whoa. And then he said, but listen, let me tell you the story. And he said, when he was 5 in 1935, his family fled Hitler. They were from a German-speaking, mostly Jewish town that was in Poland because of the way World War I drew the line. But they fled Hitler to New York. And he said, I was 5 years old. New York City, I was lost. You can imagine a 5-year-old from a little village in Poland showing up in New York. But he said when he was 9, his folks took him out to the 39 World's Fair. Einstein was cutting the ribbon at the World Zionist Exhibit Pavilion, and he had kind of the same experience in a certain way, but it was like, oh, look at this world. Oh, I see. So there's a bigger thing out there, and this is going to be like what my future might be. And he described in very eloquent terms how it affected him. And so I asked him if he would write that as our introduction for our bid, and he agreed. And he agreed, along with Marilyn Carlson Nelson and with Walter Mondale and Arnie Carlson and a few people, to lend their names to the process. I do think they imagined it kind of crazy, but for Rudy Boschwitz, he had had such a great experience. For others, oh, okay. But for this organization, which has now evolved as a kind of public-private partnership, it was really crucial to have those leaders and to have their kind of credibility and to have the story. But it unfolds in a kind of complicated way because it turns out that first we had to get both houses of the U.S. federal government, House and Senate, to undo decisions they made back in 1999 and 2000. Then we had to get 2 different presidents to sign off on this in a big way. We had to move Commerce Department and the State Departments. We had to lift them up and push them over the line. And a lot of this resulted in sort of 3 things that I think are the basis for why I'm so optimistic today that we're going to host this World's Fair in the summer of 2027. The first is that we had the good fortune of kind of a public process to come up with the theme. So World's Fairs, just to do a 101 here, there's 6-month-long World's Fairs every 5 years. 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020, and they often have a kind of a general theme. The one next year is in Dubai, Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. 2010, Shanghai, Cities of the Future. In between, there's always a 3-month one, Think Summer, and they have to be a really specific theme. A few years ago, it was in Korea, it was on Save the Oceans. One after that, Astana, Kazakhstan, it was on alternative energy. The next one in Buenos Aires, creative economy. We knew we had to have a very specific bid, and the bid that evolved really came out of a kind of a comment and a kind of pitch that Marilyn Carlson Nelson actually tape recorded and put on YouTube, arguing that our theme should be focused around health and wellness. Partly because, of course, we have so many institutions that are critical. Mayo, University of Minnesota, Illini, you name it. But also because it's very personal and very individual. Kind of everybody has a story. It turns out that we took over the state fair one year and did a big exhibit and had everybody vote on the theme. And of course, for kids could vote and old people could vote, and people would think like why don't we make it beer? And yeah, I mean, you're at the state fair. But anyhow, we settled on health and wellness. And we settled on linking it to the Sustainable Development Goals that have come out of the UN and out of the other organizations about health and wellness. I can talk more about that later. But in that process, what we did not know was that when we began talking to the other countries, because countries have to vote for you, and it's generally a foreign minister making a decision and telling an ambassador to, which button to push. But when we would tell them that our theme was health and wellness, people would light up. And they would say that is the most important universal topic. And so that's one of the kind of criteria people wanted to apply to everyone. It applies to governments because there's so big spending. It applies to a person. It applies to your mother or your daughter. I mean, it applies to everybody. And because it's truly universal, everybody has a story to tell. Because we were thinking of, we are the center of the universe for medical device and medical IT and, all of that. Mayo is the #1 hospital in the world and blah, blah. But in fact, World's Fairs are about learning from everybody. And people would say, oh, we love that subject. We have something to share. And in fact, at one of the first meetings of this group, they meet twice a year in Paris, the ambassador from Turkey came up to us and says, oh, my name is so-and-so, and I'm the ambassador from Turkey. And Turkey bid twice to host a World's Fair, big one, on health and medicine, their site, Izmir, was for 2,000 or 3,000 years has been a center of sort of medicine and healing, and they had a really great story. He said, we're so supportive of what you're doing and picking that theme. We have a lot of documents, we can help you. And then he kind of leaned over and he said, oh, by the way, I'm a badger. What? Yeah, we had another badger that we didn't know about, like on our team, right? So this was like a shock. He said, yeah, I got my PhD at Madison. And then he started in on Madison PhD kind of stories. You could picture this, right? This went on for a little bit. But he said, the reason I'm telling you this story is that I want you to know something. The United States had sort of stormed out of this organization, didn't pay their dues, had back dues, and, whatever. And he was saying, I want you to know that almost everybody in this room, so it was a couple hundred, basically ambassadors to France or to Paris. So we're all pretty senior people. If you're an ambassador to Paris, it's kind of like Tokyo or Washington or New York or something. You're pretty senior. You have most certainly served in the United States, in Washington or New York or in Chicago. You probably have gone to school, maybe high school as an exchange or in college, or like him, he got his PhD. We know the United States. We love the United States. You are going to be very warmly welcomed. And I think that message, there were about 12 of us who had gone on this delegation to push our bid. I think it helped us open our hearts to that warmth and not feel so defensive or try to explain, well, we're trying to get the U.S. to pay the bill and all that. No, people love the United States. And in fact, that love for the United States and that appreciation for the theme and the appreciation for our hard work resulted in something kind of remarkable happening, which is on our first time making a run at this, we came close enough. Well, we actually got voted into the final round, which almost never happens. I mean, this was kind of our first time, and there were many difficulties and challenges. But that was because people really appreciated our bid, our theme. They appreciated our history of being welcoming and warming, and they appreciated that we were working hard to make this happen, and we were kind of, in a sense, getting re-engaged. And so we got into the finals. We didn't win the finals. That would have been a miracle. We've had many miracles in this, but that was one we didn't have. But immediately people say, you just got to get back in there again. Come on, get back in there again. You've got the right theme, you've got the right place, etc. And so those of us who were there in Paris for the vote we lost is how some people say it, but that we all felt great about. Look at all this support. Folks back here, they're, you lost, and and what are you going to do now, Mark? Blah, blah, blah. You're going to run for office, blah, blah, blah. Said, no, we've invested so much of the time and money of people here to get us this far. Now we know what we're doing. And I didn't tell this story yet, I'll tell it. We had gotten 2 governments and 2 bodies of Congress to get behind our bid, and we were pushing hard. So the process required first that the U.S. government name Minnesota as the favored bid, call it the candidate city. And so, but we weren't a member yet, so it was very complicated. And so around November 15th or something like that of 2016, we had gotten a really strong positive review recommendation from the Department of Commerce. And so that's kind of the first step, the U.S. Department of Commerce. And then they recommend to the president that the president put, let's say, Minnesota's bid forward. And so on November 15th or so, 2016, it was quite chaotic over at the White House. And so our thing lands on the plate over there with a lot of other things on the plate. And, and December 15th, 6 o'clock in Paris was the absolute deadline for that part. And so anyhow, I'm talking about the expo at I think a French-American chamber, gala of some kind up at the Windows on the World up at the IDS. And I was just, making a kind of a lame joke, just saying, well, if any of you in this room are really close friends, personal friends to President Obama, I need your help, anyhow, because we were running out of time and that would have been the end of it. And a guy comes up and says, well, I don't know Obama, but I'm the head of fundraising for the development committee for the Board of Trustees of St. John's University. He's a wealth manager, and that was one of his things. And he says, I think that our President Hempstead, St. John's, maybe could have some influence with his most famous alumni, Dennis McDonough, the President's Chief of Staff. He said, well, let's try to find out. So he pulls out his phone. It's like 10 at night. And he texts Hempstead. Hempstead responds immediately because he's in China shaking down donors, right? Alumni, right? He says, yeah, I think we can take care of this. And so over the course of a couple of days, a lot of paper went back and forth. He wrote an incredibly beautiful, powerful letter. And sometime in the middle of the night, my youngest brother and his wife were sort of UN international people. They're based right now in Bangkok, and we were in Southeast Asia. I get a call in the middle of the night, say, this is so-and-so from the White House, and I just want you to know that this got delivered to the office in Paris at 4 o'clock on December 15th. I said, oh, that is really great. Let me call, President Hempstead to thank him. He said, oh, no, we told him a couple of days ago. So, little miracles happen. So that meant one thing, that our bid was being put forward. But for it to move forward meant that the U.S. had to pay back dues and agree to rejoin and undo laws that were made and language that was made in 1998, 99, 2000, in that era. And so we began working very closely with the Trump administration, the State Department, the Commerce Department, the House, the Senate. Betty McCollum is our person from Minnesota on appropriations, and that committee was important not for money, but because they had language that was kind of prohibited the repayment, et cetera. Tom Emmer became the lead, and he did a fantastic job. On the Senate side, Senator Klobuchar is very close to Senator Cornyn from Texas, who's number 2, and they made a little team, and Texas was one of our partners. Texas has been really desiring to do one of the big expos. They don't want to do one of these little short ones. Like us, they want to do a big one. And so I would walk on, well, what can we do for you today? I was like, oh, here's my friend Mark, help him out here. So over the course of the next 4 or 5 months, we were able to kind of build the support in the House and the Senate to pass unanimously in both. It was very complicated. I won't go into that. But to get this passed out of the Congress, on the President's desk, out of the President's desk, at the State Department, instructing them X, Y, and Z. And we did this in time to be able to be part of the process, but we had to convince over half of these 169 countries at a June meeting, so this is June of 17, that we should be allowed into the finals. And so we were able to do that. That's a very interesting and kind of a fun story, but anyhow, we got into the finals. And we got to the finals, we did such a good job that people immediately began saying, let's go, let's do this again. So when we came back, we began the process of both working to make that happen, but second, to kind of educate the broader community that when you invest and you get close, you can decide a couple different things. Well, I'm off to Florida or whatever, or hey, we got pretty close. This is worth doing. Let's go. And for me, it's just like on the Optimist side, it's just not a question. When I think back to the stories, my story, President's story, Rudy Boschwitz's story, I think, oh yeah, our young people could have that opportunity. And I began seeing other stories. I mentioned that Dubai is hosting the expo next winter actually. The closer for their bid was Bill Gates, who says, I was 12, I went to the World's Fair in Seattle, it blew my mind, it got me interested in technology, and so on and so forth. There's a young woman who's a county commissioner, so to speak, in Toronto, so I think they're called city councilors, but she has a TEDx talk, one of those big fancy, YouTube talks, where he says that when her parents immigrated to Vancouver when she was 8 or 9 or something like that, and she would go home to her grandmother, and she said, I was lost. Am I Chinese? Am I Canadian? What's Canada? And she just went on and on. She's very eloquent. And she says that when the World's Fair came to Vancouver and she went to that World's Fair, like Rudy Boschwitz's words, and they used almost the exact same words, it was transformative to her. She suddenly understood what it meant to be a Canadian, to be Chinese, to be a young person, I mean, and to look into the future. And so she's now a big cheese in Toronto. But I realized that that element made this very important to pursue. And there were kind of two parts to pursuing it. One was maintaining the momentum, so that, part of any process. But the second was getting our bid back in with enough power to keep others out. So this is, right at this moment, we are the international bid because we're the only ones with this moving forward. You're a politician, you're in a primary, you put a lot of money in the bank and say, hey, you wait till next time, I mean, they're just, you're doing. But the reason why I'm optimistic about this is that people so appreciated Minnesota, our theme, our bid, our work, but they also had a sense of a kind of tradition, a kind of a reputation. And I'll just tell you a couple stories about that. I wanted the vote from Lithuania. And I set up a meeting with the ambassador from Lithuania in Paris to beg him for his vote. And, the first half hour of that meeting was a little uncomfortable because it was a very long list of complaints about visa problems, so. But when we got done with that, then he said, come here. And he, beautiful office, and the back door, and he went out the door, and it's a long spiral staircase, and there's a huge handmade flag. And he said, you see that flag? It's giant. I said, well, yeah. He said, well, that flag went into hiding the day Hitler seized our nation. And that flag didn't come out of hiding until the Americans helped liberate us. And he patted me on the back and sent me on my way. So when you have those kinds of experiences, you realize that the connections are deep and that the opportunities are strong. You can certainly ruin reputations. You can certainly throw away or in some way degrade things that have happened. But as a practical matter, Minnesota itself, in the context of the nation, is much loved and appreciated, whether it's my friend from Turkey who was pointing out those who had lived here and that part, or Second World War, of course, is a deep connectivity. But there are a lot of other things that connect us as well. Like, for example, people are worried about health and wellness, and they're looking for more global kind of solution. Obesity is a problem kind of everywhere. Diabetes, I mean. So we have continued that process. Some of you know that the center of gravity of this is kind of what we call the South Loop. The city of Bloomington, the mall, the airport, others quite active. There's a big process to produce the next version of the bid. We did that. Then the Commerce Department sent 8 people out to check out our bid, and they had a wonderful, wonderful site visit and a very strong recommendation. So the recommendation, I think on the 15th of this month, is that Secretary Ross will then make the recommendation to the President that we be named the candidate. They use the word candidate city. We're kind of careful to call this Minnesota, but anyhow, candidate city. And that process then would proceed with the declaration of our bid as the official U.S. bid for the summer of 2027. And the next step in that would probably be our having a major exhibit, kind of like a corner, in the U.S. Pavilion at the Expo next winter in Dubai. That's the big one. Something that talked about our state, our theme. It would be a national bid, of course, at that time. But it's a way that we can continue the process of moving it forward. I'm optimistic about this process because we also really do know what we're doing, but also the people working on this are very hardworking and really devoted and have a lot of attention. Things can get in the way. Things can pop up. I was certain Poland was going to be the victor in we were in the finals with 3, and Poland was certainly the best. And the weekend before the vote, there was a gigantic 150,000 or 200,000 person white supremacist rally demonstration in Warsaw that was blasted all over French TV all weekend long. And so by the time we came around to the vote on Monday, they ended up, the best they did was to tie, and then they lost. I mean, it was kind of coincidental in a way, but also was, that's the world. It's complicated. And I felt really bad for the Polish. This was, I think, their 3rd run. And they decided that that was their last one. They were very helpful to us. But anyhow, I'm just saying that being optimistic is part of having a perspective and how you choose to get up and keep going in the morning when things are hard. But it's also part of just saying that in this world, you keep going. I know quite a few people in this room. There's a whole bunch of people I don't know, which is wonderful for me. But there's a bunch of you I know, and I know your lives have had their own curveballs and bumps in the road and tragedies. Things happen. And generally, we need more than just our personal optimism to hang on. My wife and I lost our daughter to a drunk driver, and it was the church people that held us together that helped us survive. And so these things are part of being an optimist, is being a realist and facing on. But the real thing is, are we planting the seeds? Are we planting the seedlings and the saplings so that those who come behind us have other opportunities, or the ones that we had, and perhaps better? Starting a new club in downtown St. Paul and having that article this morning as and the coolest, was it last year, like the coolest city, or I don't know, there was a word, I didn't even know what the word was actually, but something about St. Paul. But something like a World's Fair in a region where we make it a joke to say, well, you got to kind of lure people here because they don't know Minnesota, right? I mean, they don't know Minnesota. But once you get them here, then you can't get rid of them, that we joke about this. But a World's Fair is like 90 days in a row of a Super Bowl, 90 Super Bowls. It's a lot of people. In the Milan World's Fair, the last big one, was 1 billion people online, which is a lot. And in the world of connectivity and relationships, when people say, oh, online and virtual and all of that, people also really get the importance of the personal connection, the personal meeting, the personal seeing and touching and feeling. And so on the question of health and wellness, there's a lot of angles on health and wellness. I mean, we're also the world center for treatment and addiction and helping people recovery. We are the world center. Medical device, we are the universe's center. I mean, there are things that we are special about, but we're also welcoming people who are really open to learning from and welcoming others. Now, welcoming is a complicated thing, but it's a thing that I'm mainly selling when I'm convincing those 169 countries that they ought to invest to put an exhibit here and a pavilion and staff and, not just vote for us, but be here. And I tell them, we got a lot of history of being welcoming here. We had Native American people who welcomed others who came, and out in Pipestone, there's a whole sacred ground where the pipe is harvested, the rock is harvested. It was a sacred ground. Weapons weren't allowed, everybody was welcome. We welcome people from all over the planet into our community here for a long time, and we continue to do so. Sometimes it's more complicated. Let's say you've built a terrific state like Minnesota, and you love it. You deeply love it. Even those of us from Iowa, North Dakota. Actually, I was born in Georgia. But you can come to a conclusion, which is, come on over. This is a wonderful place. And if you've ever been to Ellis Island, you've seen the big posters, immigrate to Minnesota, perfect weather, deep soils. Well, okay, 50%, I mean, come on. I mean, not bad. Plus, anyhow. Or you could say, this is great. I just want it for us. I don't want other people coming. And so these are two different views. And you got to grow more optimist clubs, because it doesn't just happen. No matter what our mamas might have wanted, we don't necessarily always come out the way they might have wanted. And I was really kind of shocked a little bit about this recently. It's the 75th of everything related to the Second World War and, the UN and all that stuff. And I'd been promising my wife for 20-some years we'd go down to New Orleans to what was then just the D-Day Museum. Her dad was the Big Red One, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, first day Omaha Beach, Bulge. And I had kept saying, we'll have a meeting there or something, some excuse. And we hadn't gone. And when I was asked to come out of retirement and take this job leading Global Minnesota, she said, well, I know what that means, which, means, every night. And she said, that promise about going to New Orleans, we're going to go the day after Christmas, and we're going to go to that D-Day Museum. And we did, which is kind of amazing. We just kind of up and went, But we there, and I'm, viewing it all. My dad was, a China Marine, so I was really interested in, some of the Pacific stuff, and she was really into the first and all that. But we come reeling around a corner, and there's a whole wall about Charles Lindbergh and the treasonous America Firsters of the Second World War. And it describes Minnesota in a way that I'm not necessarily used to. But it was describing the sort of battle to, move support from the Allies to Germany and to keep us out of the war and all that stuff. But it was a really heavy reminder that our own state has sometimes different views on some things that are pretty important. For those of us whose dads were in that war, it's a little hard to get your head around Charles Lindbergh out there advocating that Hitler's great and Goering's great and all. But it was a reminder that we have to intentionally and consciously build out optimism, welcoming, respect. We have to build these things out because they don't just happen. We have to remind promises made to ourselves and to others. We have to remember truths. We have to advocate for the things that can bring opportunities. It was remembering how that 64 World's Fair affected me and others who I've talked to is, part of my motivation. But in general, people want to be positive. They want to be optimistic. They want to do things. They want to make the world a better place for their kids or their communities. You represent many in your communities who have that feeling, and then we try to find and give opportunities for that to happen. It's hard to know the two phases, what they'll look like. What I've said, and my wife just turned 70 and she wanted to hike the Grand Canyon, so we went and hiked the Grand Canyon for her 70th, and my 70th is coming right up, and I'm not sure I'll pick that, having done that. But we all have things that are those markers in life that say, okay, this is where I am and this is where I want to go. Jerry Kaiser was just showing me a 101-year-old World War II vet he might be sprier than us, Jerry, I'm not sure, but he looked pretty good. But we don't know if we're going to make 101. We don't know if we're going to make it home. We don't know if our loved ones, what's going to happen. And so we got to kind of each day do the best we can. The thing about my commitment to this, which is what I was asked to talk about, is that I've said to people, I'm focused on this till we win that bid. And that vote could come as early as November of 2021, which, by the way, is just around the corner. or November 2022. But after that, then there needs to be an army of young people who pull off this gigantic event. I brought a bunch of people over to see all of our good work during the Super Bowl. And our main consultant in Paris, you know, helped to kind of organize this up, actually is a former ambassador from El Salvador, who's married and living in Paris, and he signed up and volunteered for the Super Bowl on the official thing. Did the whole thing, got interviewed, all that, came over here, got his blue outfit. He was assigned outdoors. And every day I'd bring another face mask or more, you know, I mean, really. But he was so embraced when he wore that blue coat. Some of you here were volunteers. You know what I'm talking about. The family feeling of that 10 or 12,000 people, but not just them, but everybody thanking them and talking to them and all of that. You know, it was a kind of thing that says, you know, Lord, take me now. This is as good as it gets. And so when we get that little thing signed and we are the bid and we are going to have an expo and there's a bunch of young people taking this thing on and doing it, I wouldn't say that'll be time for fishing because there's also things you'd like to do. But as a practical matter, it's part of what we get to do intergenerationally. I'm looking at the room. You got a lot of young people in the room, and that is really good. You also have plenty of us with gray hair or losing hair. We're all in the process of handing off. That's part of what we're doing. And so the World's Fair is a kind of thing that Rudy Boschwitz helped surprise and energize me, and others have helped to bring it along. I hope to be able to be handing that off in a certain kind of way. But I hope that we do that in a way that is a big uniting thing that then Minnesotans can all feel a kind of pride in it, both that the world has recognized us as a welcoming place, but also, you know, it's just really hard for us to brag, but we love to show off the lower 40 and the new tiling or our garden. And so to overcome our unwillingness at times to kind of brag, I want to make sure we have the biggest show in town, the next great American World's Fair, right here in our hometown. Thank you very much.